So this week will be faster, more complicated, and more interesting than last week when I was mostly trying to lay the theoretical groundwork and explain why lobbying isn't a completely legitimate charitable activity. So we're going to move faster and through more interesting topics. Specifically, we're going to really look at details about the 501H election that we discussed last week, and then I'm going to explain to you what the private foundation rules are for funding organizations which are engaged in lobbying and which are quite lenient. Another example of how it's an encouraged and legitimate activity. And then explore how you do have to be a little bit careful sometimes in election year when lobbying can suddenly become a prohibited electioneering activity for a C3. So specifically the structure today, I'm going to go through several things that are not lobbying, just public education, a couple things that are not grassroots lobbying, just direct. You recall you have more direct allowance than grassroots allowance. And then a little bit of cautionary tales about things that may be lobbying that mostly are anti-abuse rules that were built into the structure. Then I'm going to walk you through some pretty aggressive advanced strategies. And I developed these not just because I think people should necessarily implement them, but over the years I found that people sat through 501H trainings and didn't really know kind of what to make of it, how to actually apply it. And so these advanced strategies are a little bit like mind stretchers. And so they're there kind of as an exercise to help internalize what 501H really says. And then again, the private foundations and the electioneering edges. So just a very quick overview of last week. The main upshot of last week was to emphasize how important the history is to show that lobbying is completely legit and, if anything, encouraged, and we want the charitable sector to speak up. That there's these two choices of making the election or doing nothing, and most experts recommend to make the election if you're going to do anything other than the most incidental sort of lobbying with an occasional letter. And then we learned about that there's a total allowance and a grassroots allowance, and that's slightly confusing with the fact that there's direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. And so the way it works is you can do all direct, or if you spend your grassroots allowance, then it's only the 3/4 of your allowance you can spend on direct. We saw the formula. It's kind of a sliding scale. People say to each other at parties that nonprofits can spend 20% on lobbying, but that's of the first 500,000 if they're electing. And we talked about how the expenditures would include staff time and a reasonable proportion of overhead and then direct costs that were involved. And we looked a little bit at the reporting and the way that even though you have to worry about calculating the direct and grassroots, you don't have to tie it to anything else, whereas the non-electing charities kind of have to report what sorts of things they did. One thing I thought about later that I did not last week, I was pretty careful to make clear that there's a huge difference between lobbying and candidate electioneering, because I've found over the years there's a risk when people jumble it all together and think, oh, all that stuff's kind of dangerous, just do a little bit, because you can do a lot of one and none of the other. I forgot to mention there's a third type of activity, which is 501c3 voter participation and registration. And that is one that is kind of an entirely separate set of rules. I'm not going to cover it today, but I just wanted to make it clear that that's a third small p political type of engagement that is neither lobbying nor candidate electioneering. It has to be completely nonpartisan and broad issues. Essentially, it describes the League of Women Voters in terms of the way you can do it. It's fairly hard for an issue-based C3 to resist the urge to tip its hand and not have a slant in the questions that it asks. And usually what they mean by a broad range of issues doesn't usually work. Anyway, that's a topic for another day, but I wanted to put it out there that it's a third type of small p political activity to not confuse with this. And I just want everybody to know we were going to experiment with having you sort of hold up your hand with the icon at the top, but I turn out to be operating on a small screen, so I can't see if you hold up your hands. But in the lower left corner of the of your screen, there's a place that says, in the middle, there's a chat box on the left, and you can write a question right there, and I'll see it. Or last week I missed one, and Catherine reminded me there was a question there, and I love questions, so no such thing as a stupid question. And I realize that those of you who did not dial into the conference call and are hearing me across your computer can't talk back verbally. So feel free to ask questions. It's a little bit strange in my case to have silence and I can't see any faces and I can't hear you. So launching into today, a couple of background conceptual things that are important to lay out just to begin is everything I'm going to talk about today is about public charities that have made the 501h election. So the concepts may or may not apply to non-electing charities. You may recall they're under a facts and circumstances test, and the IRS has never said whether it will use the same definitions or the same standards or anything else. It sort of provides a clue, perhaps, but nothing binding. So this is all about 501h electing public charities. The thesis behind today's work, last week I was basically trying to encourage lobbying people not to be afraid of it and to realize it's legitimate and fine and good thing. Today what I really want you to absorb is that a lot of organizations overcount their lobbying. And one way to manage that is to decide in your organization who's going to make the call on what is and what is not lobbying. It may not be your program staff. You may need to centralize that in the finance staff, and you may need program staff just to report things that could be lobbying and let finance decide whether to count it that way. One of the beauties of not having to integrate the numbers is you don't really have to do it in your general ledger unless you're spending your allowance right up to the max and need to track it in real time at that level. Even then, a work paper off to the side isn't a bad thing at all. So you may recall I talked about the possibility of sort of an incident report version rather than assimilated right into your timesheet, because one of the other confusions is that lobbying isn't a program. So people's timesheets that are broken up into programs, they never know where to put lobbying. Lobbying is a methodology that may be used in a program. But the purpose today is to make sure that we don't overcount our lobbying. Another thing to understand is that for 501h purposes, when we talk about members, all it means is your donors. It's the specific language is anyone who's contributed more than, it might be more than a nominal. Yes, it's not more than a substantial. I'm sorry, that is an error on the slides. If you've got paper, cross off substantial and write nominal. Anyone who has contributed more than a nominal amount of time or money counts as a member. And that will be very important as we get deep into some of these rules. This slide's a review from last week, but it's pretty important just to kind of hit it again to remember that it isn't grassroots lobbying until it contains all of those things, including a call to action. So there are many communications with the public. Again, back to how the laws were written to encourage it. Essentially, these are tests that say it isn't lobbying unless it has all of these components. And when we get into the advanced strategies, that's where some of the room to really stretch issue campaign dollars is. So I'm going to have two slides on this question of what is not lobbying. It's just public education. First of all, volunteer effort is not lobbying because 501h is an expenditure test. So you might spend money, I don't know, renting buses to send the volunteers to lobby day at the Capitol or something, but the volunteer time itself and their effort just simply does not count. And that can also be true if you have a very famous and influential board chair or something who holds a press conference and speaks and gets a lot of attention for your issue. If you're not paying that person, the only expenditure there would be the preparation of the press release and so on. Attempts to influence executive branch matters are not lobbying. And certainly with Clean Water Act, there's a lot of work we do that's executive branch and is not lobbying. And the thing is that in common language, you might say, we're going down to the Capitol to lobby the Department of Water or whatever, but it's not lobbying for the purpose of 501h and tax reporting for the public charity. So just because lay people call it lobbying doesn't make it lobbying here. The third one is that communications with the public expressing a view on specific legislation, but with no call to action. You could name the bill, you could say it's terrible, is not grassroots lobbying because it doesn't hit all of those elements. It's just public education, period. And it can name the bill and it can say it's terrible or it's great or whatever, and just hope the public's sensible enough to take action, and then you haven't spent any of your valuable money. Again, one of my thoughts here is if you're really working hard on an issue campaign, it's about how to squeeze all the effectively lobbying you can out of the specific amount that you have as an allowance. We will talk about one anti-abuse rule here, which has to do with electronic media immediately prior to a publicized vote. Communications with members that are expressing a view. Am I still here? I got a louder beep than usual.
You're still here, Terry.
Okay, good. Communications with members, which is, again, like I said, your donors, basically, expressing a view on specific legislation, but with no direct call to action. Now, you may remember last week when we looked at with the words call to action, there were three types that were direct. That was where you gave the phone numbers of the legislators, you gave a tear-off sheet to contact them, and there was a third definition. But an indirect call to action is where you simply list the key votes or the committee members or wherever it's hung up, but you don't actually give their phone numbers. That's called an indirect call to action, and if you do it to your members and you keep it to that, you have not yet lobbied. That's just a internal communication about an important bill. So you don't spend any of your valuable allowance on that. Communications about a broad social problem are not a specific legislative proposal. So anything that could be addressed by executive act, corporate policy, legislative policy, even if it's something that requires legislation of some sort or other, but you could get at it through tax credits or incentives or punitive measures or more regulation or whatever would be the strategy. There's any number of ways to solve a variety of problems. So you can raise all kinds of hell about what something needs to be fixed, and it's not yet a specific legislative proposal, and so it's not lobbying. Even if you send 700 people to the Capitol in buses, it's not lobbying if you're talking about a broad social problem. And so some more on what's not lobbying. You may recall there was this nonpartisan analysis, study, and research. This really lends itself to the charitable sector. They're contemplating a physical study here, but for example, in California, there was one legal feud within I believe it was, what was it? It was one of the affirmative action cutback initiatives, and it was around a 30-second television ad that would have publicized one of the important medical reviews had done a study concluding there would be fewer minority doctors in minority communities if the thing passed. And there was a lawyer prepared to issue a legal opinion that 30-second television ad would qualify as nonpartisan analysis, study, and research. It would have been pretty aggressive. But the law is written imagining a study in the classic sort of policy study. And the notion is that as long as the given piece has a substantial non-lobbying distribution, and not just to one side or the other of a proposal. So you release it to both the right-wing and the left-wing press, or send it to all the Republicans and all the Democrats and your mailing list, and you leave a bunch of copies in coffee shops around town or whatever it is, but a broad distribution of whatever it is beyond your lobbying targets, and that it has a full exposition of the facts. It can then express a view, and as long as it stops at an indirect call to action, it still is not lobbying. That's public education. And there's a lot of exploitation available in that for us. Later on, we will see one anti-abuse rule if you take that exact study and use it for certain things within 6 months, but we'll explain that in a second. Again, if you get an invitation or a request to give an opinion, recommendations, and technical advice for a legislative body, committee, or subcommittee, that is not lobbying. Once in a while, if the party or an individual politician is in a position of power, and will write you that letter on letterhead that allows you to, all the time you spend giving that testimony is not lobbying. And then there's self-defense lobbying. This is often misunderstood by groups that get government funding. So for example, many of us one way or another get EPA money, and we may, if there was a threatened cutback, which there could easily be shortly on EPA, we might want to fight about that in order to preserve funding streams for important work. That wouldn't count as self-defense lobbying. But back in 2006, when they passed the Pension Protection Act, it had a whole bunch of different rules in there that changed the playing field for nonprofits. And so things that go all the way to what is or is not tax deductible. And then this, or deductibility of contributions, there's likely to also be some discussion about whether it's good or bad to maybe disallow certain kinds of itemized deductions for highest income taxpayers. Is one of the kinds of things they're talking about right now in Congress, and there's some parts of the nonprofit world that think that could be a detriment to our income from high wealth donors, and that's the sort of thing you could speak up on because it's about the deductibility of contributions. So self-defense lobbying doesn't actually usually come up that often in issue-based work, but once in a while it does, and it is not lobbying. There's a special exclusion for that. So the next thing we want to talk about is these two things that are not grassroots lobbying. And remember, grassroots lobbying is the one that's the smallest allowance and tends to be the money that's the dearest when you're in an issue campaign. So when you're communicating with the public on ballot measures, that's direct lobbying. So out here in the West, we have a lot more of them than you do in the East, but whether that ballot measure is done by initiative or referred by the legislature, however it got on the ballot, in a case like that, the public is the legislator. So if you go back to the definition slide where direct lobbying is making contact with the legislator, in the case of a ballot measure, that is the general public. And so you're only spending direct lobbying money if you're trying to get them to vote a certain way on a ballot measure. The next one is pretty interesting, which is communications with members, encouraging them to make a direct lobbying contact, is not lobbying. That's sort of like having a staff meeting to plan to go to the Capitol. The notion is it's an internal communication within your organization, planning lobbying, but it's all direct lobbying that you're planning. The one thing you have to be careful about, like if you're writing a newsletter page to your donors, is to make sure you don't just sort of rhetorically say, so tell your friends and neighbors, because as soon as you throw that phrase in, you have now made it grassroots lobbying. We're going to see an advanced slide on these communications here in a minute. So here are some, so far I've been giving you good news items. These are a couple things to watch out for. If you have a nonpartisan analysis, study, and research, it's a particular policy report of some sort that examines the options and concludes that the best option is a certain improvement in the Clean Water Act or equivalent state legislation, and it needs to pass, and you did all that, and you stopped with an indirect call to action, and you made a substantial non-lobbying distribution, and it qualified as nonpartisan analysis, study, and research. If within 6 months you slap an alert on the top of that exact document and send it out for lobbying purposes, you have now rendered the entire thing lobbying. So there's two things there. It's 6 months, and it's the exact document. It's not the knowledge you learned while you prepared it. That's fine. That you don't render the whole thing lobbying because all the research you did to prepare that nonpartisan analysis, study, and research early in your issue campaign, that's all fine. That doesn't render it lobbying, but it's using the exact same piece. It no longer then, you have to then reach back. It's another reason why, to some degree, having finance keep track of the lobbying stuff is important, because some things do and they evolve over the year, what is and what is not lobbying. Mass media advertisements, and I hate to admit it, but I have forgotten here whether this is limited to electronic media or whether it would include things like billboards and newspaper ads. Once in a while, these laws are limited to radio and TV. But mass media advertisements within 2 weeks of a highly publicized vote by a legislative body or committee, even with no call to action, you recall communications with the public, if you just say this is a terrible bill, are not lobbying. They are if you time it to occur right before a highly publicized vote, like this this upcoming federal thing about the debt ceiling and so on. Although that you could argue it's a broad social problem, probably. In any case, that's one anti-abuse rule. Probably most of us are too small to be doing lots of mass media advertising anyway. And then keep in mind, preparation for lobbying can be a little bit difficult to figure out when it starts and what it was, but it's one of the good answers there is to always make non-lobbying use of anything you learn so that your basic research never is characterized entirely as lobbying. So briefing papers and stuff that are just good backgrounders are always useful, as just partly to show that your work wasn't all focused just on one legislative change. Contact with executive branch officials, encouraging them to take specific action on legislation, is direct lobbying. So that they count as sort of like legislators in that case. So remember, it's executive branch matters that are not lobbying, but once in a while you'll be in there talking to some, trying to get support from the governor's office for a certain bill or whatever, and that could be lobbying. And then the thing to repeat again, just watch out for that. So tell your friends and neighbors in communications that you're trying to have protected under the members rule. So here's the advanced slide. There is a lot of information on this slide. So what this is thinking about is a mailing. And the question is, when is a mailing to your members? And the answer to that is, if it's 85%, greater than 85% members, might be greater than or equal to. I probably looked it up, so it probably is more than 85%, but that would mean 85.1 would be fine. So that means, for every 85 members on your list, you can put 14 other people in there. This is all going to lead to an argument that very well parsed lists are very valuable. If a mailing goes primarily to members, that's defined as greater than 50% members, and otherwise it's primarily non-members if it is less than 50% members in the mix. So depending on those, you get different answers to the 4 questions across the top, which is, how would you split the lobbying versus non-lobbying parts of the communication? What happens if you say tell your friends and neighbors in it? What happens if you have a direct call to action? And what happens if you have only an indirect call to action? And I'm going to stop real quick because I forgot that when I was telling you the direct and indirect, I stumbled on what the 3 were. I'm going to look very fast back at last week's slides so that I can restate the direct and indirect calls to action. So the 3 definitions of a direct call to action are telling them to contact the legislator, providing the legislator's contact info, or providing a response mechanism like a tear-off postcard or click here and we'll send an automated email. An indirect call to action simply lists the key allied, opposed, or undecided legislators on a specific legislative proposal, but does not provide contact info. So when we're looking at this slide with the communications, the 4th column is, what if your communication about a good or bad legislative proposal has only an indirect call to action? So for those quote-unquote only to members, which is that 85%, you can split on subjects between lobbying and non-lobbying. Any sort of reasonable basis is fine. It's a favored communication, essentially. But if you say tell your friends and neighbors, it's going to be a grassroots lobbying communication. If you have a direct call to action, meaning so contact your legislator and you're talking to your members, that will be direct lobbying because remember, when you're communicating with members, it's like an internal staff meeting. So it's not grassroots lobbying. And only an indirect call to action where you just list those key legislators without their phone numbers. So in a minute, one of the strategies we're going to talk about is well-trained members. In that case, it's 0% lobbying and 100% public education. So you can see how it really favors communications with members. Now, if the given mailing is about half members and half other people, again, you can split reasonable, the materials in a given newsletter, say, unless you say tell your friends and neighbors, and then the lobbying message will be grassroots. If there's a direct call to action, you get to split the mailing. The part you're talking to the members is direct lobbying, and the part you're talking to the public is grassroots lobbying. And if it's an indirect call to action, you can split the percent to the members, it's public education, and to the rest of the public, it's grassroots. So if the list is still 50% members, you still get pretty favorable splits on what you do with the cost. This is, I realize, in some ways less important in today's world of email communications where the cost of one blast is negligible other than the preparation time. But even preparation time can add up. And again, my thesis here is taking issue campaign dollars and stretching them as far as you possibly can. So that bottom row is the one where you're talking to the public. And in that case, if you send out any kind of newsletter or publication, this is the one where there's an anti-abuse rule that information on the same specific subject is all grassroots lobbying. So you can't have an educational piece on page 2 and a call to action on page 6 that's a half a page and claim that only half a page of the whole publication was lobbying. They'll make you grab page 2 as well. And one thing environmentalists often get a little tangled up with this stuff is people get very close to their policy and what they see as same specific subject. They'll say, well, no, those are very different. But I would argue that essentially rivers and watersheds in the mind of the people who write these rules would be same specific subject in some ways. Perhaps not. There are different ways to get at it. You could be distinguishing between two different things. But in any case, same specific subject when you're really close to an issue is sometimes issues look more different than they do to the outside. And all those other things, it's all 100% grassroots lobbying if your communication goes to the public. So even an indirect call to action, if it's saying this is a good or bad specific legislative proposal and it's primarily to the public, that's grassroots lobbying where you're spending your valuable allowance. So that slide is that's a really important slide. Does anyone need to type a question in or speak up if you're on the phone? This is one that sometimes is valuable to just print that one slide and have it handy if you're really in an active issue campaign. So now we're going to run through some advanced strategy ideas. It's going to be one idea per slide. And the reason they're on a pink background all of a sudden is because I should disclose to you that I ran these by one of my old lawyer bosses and asked her what she thought. And she kind of liked the idea. We used to joke that I'm a soldier for the revolution, but it hasn't actually been, no lawyer has sprinkled holy water on some of these, and some of these are pretty pushy, so I just feel it necessary to kind of give you that disclaimer so you don't all go jumping off some cliff and blame me later. But as again, part of the purpose of these is to stretch your mind about 501H. So the first one is carefully parse your list. The better you can get at database management so that you can do a drop. For example, for a time, two different of my jobs have been involved with the back office functions at moveon.org, and they are very able to parse their list. So they operate with a real entrepreneurial young staff all over the country, and one of them comes up with an idea to, take on so-and-so about something or other. And if they're unsure about whether that'll fly with all their members, they might give them a permission to make a drop to everybody in 3 states that's responded to a request to give on a good government topic in the last 6 months or whatever, and they can drop those. So they can really, at any given time, they're really on top of their list. So database management, list management, so that you can, if you're really tight on spending lobbying money and you're in some battle where you're really trying to win it, knowing exactly who you're mailing to can really help. And it's all based on that last complicated slide we saw. So the subpoints, I'm not going to read through them because it's really just emphasizing how valuable that slide can be in an issue campaign. Another one is to establish annual patterns. For example, a lot of organizations like to issue a report card at the end of a legislative session in their state on people's voting records, whether they were good or bad. Let's say you have an annual legislative session that ends in about June. If you always get that done by about the first week in August, and you do it year in, year out, the fact that it's an election year, you're going to be protected. It won't look like you did it to tip over the election because it's just your normal routine. It's part of reporting to your members on how the legislative cycle went, and it really will help protect you that way. It can also help with your, if you do polling and survey research, it can make it appear to, it can demonstrate that your main purpose here is about the issues, and it really isn't. One of our problems is very often Democrats are more favorable to environmentalism, and we could really literally be clean as a whistle about not wanting to influence politics, but just the nature of our work plays right into Democrats' hands. And some of our funders give us money because they want to essentially pay us to be establishing the public context in which these debates are taking place. And so some of the funders' incentives and purposes in giving us money are electioneering, frankly. And so it's important that we, and so our problem is that we could be working hard on our issues and not really care about parties, but it still ends up coming across partisan if we're not careful. So these annual patterns is very helpful. Same thing if you have a banquet every year, and you like to invite office holders who've done good work and are allied to speak at that. If you do that all the time, then if it just happens that that office holder is going to be running for re-election in 4 months and the campaign's kind of started, you're much less likely to look like you're trying to intervene. I'd still warn them, please don't make a pitch for your campaign from our microphone, and no, your staff can't set up a hardcore partisan table in the back of the room. It's not going to be lost on your members, the person's running for office, so they just need to keep it straight and speak as an office holder who's doing good work in your area. But annual patterns is a key part of making it clear that you're working for the issue, not for some party. Here's an interesting one when I talk about pushy examples. Because the way this lobbying allowance works, some states have a legislature that meets every other year, say from January to June. So if an organization operating in a state like that set its fiscal year to end on March 31st, it could bring 2 years of lobbying allowance to bear on each legislative session, because the legislative session would straddle 2 fiscal years, and it only happens every other year. So you could essentially spend double your allowance on one legislative session. So, and fiscal years can also matter depending if you are somewhere that you work on the ballot measure strategies, paying attention to what the ballot measure cycle looks like. Now, in general, I'm an accountant, and so I like calendar fiscal years because it's easier than other kinds of fiscal years. It's also easy to have one that matches to your main government fund or whatever. So a lot of other reasons to have a fiscal year other ways. But this would be one way to really maximize your lobbying allowance in a state with an every 2-year legislature. Another strategy, this is sort of repeats an obvious one from earlier, is just to understand that nonpartisan analysis, study, and research. Learn to do it, learn to understand what it is, learn how to write it so that you can take a position on specific legislative proposals, including an indirect call to action, and just learn to always make a substantial non-lobbying distribution. And, you know, so just make sure that you know how to master that, and you can do quite a lot. It's not lobbying at all. And then the other beauty thing is anything that's not lobbying, you can spend private foundation money on when it says you can't spend this on lobbying. That's one of the binds we'll talk about in a little bit. But so remember, if it's not lobbying, that means all these kinds of money you get that say no lobbying with our money, you can use it for. This is one where I suggest that if you're really pressing your allowance right up to the max, it's a good idea to calculate and monitor not only your allowance, which is the excise, it's actually called the excise non-taxable amount. That heading's a little wrong. And that 150% 4-year revocation ceiling, so that you, if you're in some huge battle that straddles a couple years and you're sort of wondering about this preparation for lobbying kind of edge and how much of our work, and are they going to think this whole staff position was a lobbyist and stuff, sometimes you can sort of calculate, well, what if they did? How bad would it be? And as long as you're not going to blow that 4-year allowance by 50%, you wouldn't lose your C3. And so sometimes if you're really in an issue campaign and maxing out your dollars, calculating both those levels, and the 150% revocation level, you might remember from last week, is a 4-year basis. You pay a tax, though, in 1 year if you blow your allowance. So it's not like you'd want to lose in this, but I'm saying if they came in and audited you and you'd taken an aggressive position on something that was not lobbying, what if they took a different position than you? What's the downside risk? So sometimes this is about knowing your full downside risk. And if it looks like it would be more than 150% of the 4-year allowance, then I might be a little more careful and pull back in some ways, because losing the C3 can destroy your organization. Another one is to master calls to action. Remember the whole notion of what's a direct call, what's an indirect call. That's another one that's very hard to remember. I had to look back myself to remind. That's another one sometimes it's almost worth taping to the bulletin board if you're really engaged in it actively. So the thoughts here are train your base. You know, not every communication might need a call to action if they all know what they're supposed to do. I'll give you another couple thoughts on that in a minute. Understand that nonpartisan analysis, study, and research can have an indirect call to action and still not be lobbying. Understand that communications with members that have an indirect call to action can be about specific legislation and are not lobbying. And the whole anyway, so just if you master the whole calls to action, and it's hard to coordinate, again, if the knowledge base about this is in the finance staff and it's the program staff who are writing the flyers and the articles. It can be a little hard to integrate that stuff. Part of it is building trust and getting people to come ask for help as they're doing it, or saying, would you look over these sentences and make sure we're spending this kind of money, or what have you. Master discussion of broad social problems. If you're planning an issue campaign where you know it's going to culminate in, if your goal is to get a particular kind of legislation passed, that doesn't mean you can't start a lot earlier laying the groundwork, talking about that something needs to be done about this problem. You could spend lots of non-lobbying money raising all kinds of hell and building momentum for it, and then lobby later on after you had already developed a lot of the groundwork and softened people up and taught them a lot about it and gotten everything ready to go, and then start spending your money. So sometimes thinking in multi-year arcs can be very helpful. Train your staff. This gets back a little bit to who's going to make the call, but even if finance staff is going to make the final call, program staff have to know how to spot what could be direct or grassroots. And it's also good to document any training efforts that you do, including your having attended this one. You might want to print it and just throw it in a file somewhere. If IRS ever said, are you making these numbers up? And you say, no, we pay close attention. We're doing our best. We even sat through this training. All those kinds of things can be useful. Tax law is always about facts and circumstances. You might even consider adding to your employee manual a brief comment about what some certain kinds of controls, checking with your boss if you think it might be, or coordinating centrally before you go off on a lobbying thing. If you're close, if one part of your organization needs the whole allowance, other parts may need to understand that, so they stand down and don't spend any lobbying money or something like that. Just you might decide you need broader controls. Once you train them, it allows them to account for their time accurately or report it on an incident report or what have you, and spot things. And it also will allow them to construct issue campaigns. So if program staff really get the difference between broad social problem and specific legislative proposal, they can plan their arc of their issue accordingly. And too often I find our side jumps all the way to the proposal before we lay the groundwork. So a little bit of a hidden agenda or opinion of mine in encouraging that work on broad social problem is that nuts and bolts community organizing before we go into battle is all important. I've seen many groups over the years kind of bankrupt themselves, going right into a huge ballot measure without having done the necessary work on the ground ahead of time. Training your members. So if you've got donors and members, think of it as sort of an annual renewal welcome kit. Imagine a refrigerator magnet that has, you can get them printed up quite cheap sometimes by what are called advertising specialty companies, the same ones who will sell you pens and trinkets and coffee mugs. Get a refrigerator magnet that has all the legislators and their phone numbers. And, you send that out in one mailing, and then later on through the year, you can communicate them with only an indirect call to action. And hopefully they've got the thing on their refrigerator and they're trained and they know what to do with it. So even with a relatively small, quote-unquote, membership, you can potentially avoid spending lobbying dollars and have a pretty activated group of people that will help move things forward. I think issue campaigns lend themselves to a 5-year planning arc. Some of this goes beyond organizations that are only a 501c3, but I have this picture of just the perfect structure where an organization has a C3, a C4, and maybe even a candidate PAC, and that at any given time it's working on maybe 3 different sorts of issue campaigns, and the first one's in the earliest stages of public education, the second one's in the lobbying stage, and the third one they're busy trying to take the people out of office who cause trouble or defend the ones who were brave enough to step forward and support the proposal with the PAC. So and I can just picture kind of moving these issues through. If we were not on the defensive and on the offensive, we could perhaps learn to think that way. You can get invited to give technical advice. It's interesting, the one time in my life that I had direct experience with this, I was sitting in a woman's office years ago, and it's kind of fun because she was at River Alley. Well, I can name her, she wouldn't mind. It was Liz Paul when she worked for Snake River Alliance, probably, 25 years ago. And I taught her this rule, and she said, oh, I can try it, because she was about to go down to Boise and testify the next week. And she picked up the phone and called a friendly legislator who was chair of a committee or subcommittee, and she's sort of like, hey, Bob, would you be willing to send me a letter and letterhead inviting me to testify? And he said, sure, Liz, but but then he said, boy, you must be in some trouble. And it reminded me of the way gossip can spread in a small state. So that's a little bit of a cautionary tale. But there are plenty of times, certainly at the national level, where one side or the other, when their more likely friendly party is in charge of committees, get themselves invited in order to not be spending their lobbying allowance. If you've got a C3, C4, or you even have a friendly C4 that might be willing to do it for you, you can sort of bank your lobbying money every year. It's one way to kind of truly save up your allowance. So you can make lobbying grants from your C3 to the C4, or for that matter, a 5 or a 6 once in a while. Those are in our kind of work. And they can spend unlimited amounts on lobbying. Now, you'd have to probably grant it out. To report back to a charity funder, they may end up having to accept restrictions and having to worry about their own tracking of grassroots and direct lobbying, just because that's what the money was restricted for. But this is one way that C3, C4 tandems save their C4 money, is that every year, if they've got any left over, the C3 grants it over to the C4 to be used later. And that's one fashion of using these tandem organizations. So, anybody want to put in something about those advanced topics? I assume those of you who were here last week probably know I'm moving through quite a bit more material this week in a way in terms of mind candy. Anything in the chat window there? No? Okay. Don't be shy. As I say, if you have a question, other people do too. And I only have about 2 more slides, and then we'll definitely have about 10 minutes to encourage questions. So, private foundations. First of all, a private foundation can always give a public charity general support. They don't even need to think about these issues. But every now and then, you want to ask for grants for a project or program which clearly has lobbying as part of what it's going to do. And the rule is that the private foundation is absolutely fine as long as its grant is less than the total non-lobbying part of that program. And that could even be true for 3 different private foundations. So if you had a $100,000 program that was going to do a bunch of public education and then push a bill, and it was going to spend the first half of the year laying the groundwork and talking about a broad social problem and doing communications that were not lobbying, nonpartisan analysis, study, and research, and what have you. And then it was going to spend the second half of the year lobbying, as well as continuing the public education. And overall, it calculated that of the $100,000, it was going to spend $25,000 on direct and grassroots lobbying, and it fit fine within its allowance. Even if that program was paid for with 3 different $33,000 private foundation grants, it's okay. Because each of them can hide behind this rule. It's known as the Macintosh rules. It's extremely favorable to the notion of private foundations funding lobbying, and they will occasionally, if they're getting top-notch legal advice, their grants will never say you can't lobby with our money. The furthest they'll go is to say this money is not earmarked for lobbying, and if your proposal was clearly for a project that involved lobbying and they're getting top-notch advice, they would send you something to sign, which is a good faith representation that their $33,000 is less than the $80,000 non-lobbying portion or $75,000 non-lobbying portion of this $100,000 project they're supporting. And that's all they need to get. They're allowed to rely on your reports. They don't have to audit, and you could, in fact, pay for it with all private foundation money. One overlay on all this stuff about these allowances, by the way, is that you do have to look at your sources and make sure if you're entirely supported by foundation grants, there's a chance that they all say you cannot lobby with our money. That probably good half of them still say that or more because they're not getting top-notch advice, and they're afraid to push their envelope at all, and they're just afraid of the whole thing. Another really good source for a lot of this information is Alliance for Justice booklets. They've got a series of them on these topics, and they do a lot of trainings and have a blog. You definitely should get on their mailing list. But they published for a long time a short little booklet called Foundation Support for Advocacy, Myth versus Fact, which will support essentially what I'm telling you here. But this can help you be less shy about how you write grant proposals. So often in our business, it feels like they want us to do the lobbying, and they know that, and they want a proposal that talks about the victories we're going to win and what's going to be changed. And if you just think about it, they're clearly legislative, and yet they want us to say we're not lobbying and to sign something saying we won't lobby with their money, but they do want us to lobby with their money. They essentially are putting us at risk, thinking that that's the best way to protect themselves. When in fact, if they would just learn how to do this properly, they'd be much stronger. So sometimes reading that book, it can be helpful to increase your comfort level with how to raise money for an issue campaign that's going to culminate in some lobbying. And then again, remembering that all these exceptions, such as nonpartisan analysis, study, and research, also apply to your funding. So anything that is not lobbying and just public education is perfectly fine to charge to any private foundation grant, even if it says you cannot lobby with our money. They are, unless they somehow write in their own agreement with you, they redefine lobbying somehow. But if they just say lobbying, their rules on what they're not allowed to do is exactly defined the same way that lobbying for a public charity that's electing is defined. So they'll be fine. They're protected by your 501H status in what is and is not lobbying. So these rules are all, I know it's a scary world trying to figure out what to say to foundations, and they all vary, and it just takes a lifetime of experience to get used to it. Let's talk a little bit about risks. There are some, in the world of tax law, when we talk about candidate PACs, those are 527s, all of them. You hear 527 organizations used by the press, and it means a particular type of subset of 527s. But every political party and candidate committee and candidate PAC and all those for tax law purposes are 527s. That 527 is the same thing as like 501c3. It's an Internal Revenue Code section. And so there's 527 organizations, but there are also 527 activities that a C4, 5, or 6 could be doing or whatever. A few years ago, about 15, smart lawyers had gotten some rulings that you could do a certain kind of issue campaign involving door-to-door lobbying, door-to-door canvassing, and hard-hitting issue campaigns that were specifically targeted and timed to influence the election of a candidate to office. So they were activities that, in and of themselves, the activities would look like mere lobbying, but the very notion of the targeting and the timing made them 527. And the reason lawyers asked for that is because large gifts to 501c4s are potentially gift taxable and to 527s are not. And so there are various times when, and then the second reason was that in those days, if you stopped short of express advocacy on these issue campaigns and avoided FEC-type reporting, whether it was state or federal, that you would be sufficiently political to avoid the gift tax, and yet not so political you had to disclose your donors. They patched that hole with a different kind of tax law, so now you do have to disclose your donors if you're with that kind of organization. But in any case, it defined some areas where lobbying messages targeted on politicians running for office can become electioneering. And so you have to be aware of election season. And this kind of makes me roll my eyes because in today's world, certainly the U.S. House members are perpetually campaigning because they run every 2 years. So who's to say when the election season begins? But as a practical matter, September, October, November is the time when, or the equivalent maybe 6 weeks before your primary, when you have to be a little more sensitive about who's going to speak at an event and stuff like that. And just how you do your lobbying. Annual patterns is great, but otherwise, if you're doing it for the first time, I wouldn't start in a hotly contested election year because it's trying to influence elections is prohibited for charities. And of course, any lack of targeting is really helpful. there have been a lot of efforts to try and find secondary ways to get at swing districts and some of these national organizations. But if you're really not doing it for partisan reasons, you'll probably be fine if you establish a pattern, and not a pattern of party loyalty and more a pattern of issue basis. And then you also just want to avoid appearances of partisanship secondarily, like posters in your office, emails, use of phones. You can't let them use a phone bank at night and stuff too. So I remember one time I went into an organization, it was an environmental law firm, and one of the very important lawyers who was somewhat disgruntled about any number of things, I'd been told, had a poster on the filing cabinet facing, as you walked into his office, it was the first thing you saw, and it said regime change in 2004. It was talking about Bush, and I didn't know what to say because he shouldn't have had it on his wall, and if IRS or someone had come in, it would count against them. But I didn't want to annoy him, so I actually didn't say anything. But those are the kinds of things, and just during election season, being kind of careful that, because if you are really actively lobbying, it can be very easy to appear to be working on behalf of Democrats, as I said, which is what you want to avoid the appearance of. So I'm at the end of my prepared slides and comments, and there must have, I can flip back, of course, to any slide if you have a question about it. How many, if you unmute your phones with *6, how many people are actually on the phone?
Glynis is here.
Hi, Glennis.
Hi.
Anybody else on the phone?
Catherine is.
Catherine? And so anything in there make sense or surprise you, Glynis?
Well, it's all really helpful to me. Our organization has been around for 40 years, and we've never done the H election. And so I'm just trying to gather the courage and get as informed as possible to let my board know and go ahead and do it. And I had been thinking of doing it next year, but from the seminar last week, I realized I think I've been keeping good enough track this year that I should probably just file the form sometime this year, and then that means our 2011 taxes will have made the election.
Yes, and you can, and even if you don't do that much, you start to save up your allowance that way too. So, yeah, I was hoping that one of the questions, if the show of hands thing would have worked on my screen, was to ask how many people had decided to file the election after last week that hadn't before, because I'd hope that would be one effect of it. But if you need any help with the board, I know it's hard sometimes when you go alone and learn something. It's hard to sometimes take that back to your organization and not get flustered trying to explain things that are foreign. Be happy to try and help you with that, or use these slideshows or anything that'll be helpful.
Great. I was definitely planning on using some of the slides, so I appreciate that.
I'm totally open source. Nothing's copyrighted at all, so I don't even care about attribution. You can, and if you have somebody, like if you had a CPA that asked you any sort of quarrelsome questions, I have another version of this slideshow that I actually cite individual regs next to each of these things about what is not lobbying and so on. So if anybody's really geeky, regs have these long, complicated numbers to get right to the paragraph. But I've got some of these because I train CPAs a lot of times. So I've got some of these that are designed with their references right in them.
Wonderful.
Any of you on the computers want to type anything in there? Impressions are fine too, besides questions. Somebody's starting to type. A lot of times I get asked questions that make me worry at this stage because people want to try and ask whether one given activity is one type or another. And it's hard. I have to be a little careful about giving legal advice. It's a decision you're quite allowed to make without a lawyer. But, and I suppose as a volunteer to you, it's not as dangerous. But if I'm paid on contract, it's hard. So Susan says that some of it went over the heads. Susan, is there a particular section if I spent a couple minutes and went back and maybe tried to say a different way that would be helpful? Was it that slide on the most complicated one was probably the communications with members and one. We only got 5 evaluations last week, and one person had said that it was a little too slow or a little too basic. I forget which one. Yes, so Susan says some of it doesn't pertain to us right now. That's often true. It comes up in the future when you want to. The upshot, though, is that if you take away that in the future that in the past people might have been afraid to even try lobbying, and once they get comfortable with some of these what is not lobbying kinds of topics, it can help organizations stick their toe in or begin getting used to it. Just the whole notion that if you think about all the stuff I've been showing you, the rules are really designed very leniently. If a person was aggressive about learning how to work all these rules, what a layperson would call lobbying, I bet you could spend 40 or 50% on, because so much of it, things you could do that looked like lobbying to the average person wouldn't count as lobbying because they don't meet the specific the tests and so on. It's a very favorable type of law. Any other thoughts from you, Glynis, since you got a live connection here?
No, it's all just been really, really helpful.
Good. Go ahead.
Oh, probably as I get to trying to actually apply some of this retroactively to things we've been doing at the beginning of the year and really figuring out what I'm going to count as what, that's where
the Alliance for Justice has
questions.
One of their little booklets from Alliance for Justice is called Being a Player, and it's a really good step-by-step example. It uses a fictitious thing called the North American Society for Dragon Preservation or something like that, and they go through, and this story problem organization undertakes different types of issue campaigning strategies and things, and then it discusses the costing and what type of activity that is, and it really tries to apply 501H, and it's a pretty nice step-by-step guide. So I always recommend that to people, and the Alliance sells those booklets for kind of $20 a piece. And I think nowadays they might even release the PDFs on the web for free. So afj.org is their website, and they do periodic free webinars and updates on fast-moving topics in law, too. At one point, the Ford Foundation gave them a big pile of money to do nothing but try and encourage the progressive sector broadly to become more involved in lobbying. So the upshot of what I've been talking about is similar to what they often do, too. Well, I think we are at 11. I appreciate one thing for the rest of you who are on computers in the future. If you want to attend one of these and you call into the conference number, it's a toll-free number. It doesn't cost us too much, and then you can speak to the presenter if it's convenient to you and you're near a phone. I realize sometimes it works fine on the computer too, but just so you know, it's there. Anyway, thank you all. Appreciate your interest and attendance.